Nobody announced it. There was no press conference, no league memo, no warning sent to players. But somewhere between a hard foul, a viral replay, and a sudden wave of silence from front offices, the WNBA crossed a line it can't uncross. Because this wasn't just about a basketball play anymore. It was about what happens when a league finally finds its golden ticket and realizes how fragile that ticket really is. Caitlin Clark didn't just enter the WNBA as another rookie chasing stats and respect. She walked in carrying something no player before her ever had at this level: leverage. The kind that sells out arenas. The kind that moves TV numbers. The kind that turns a struggling business model into a real, bankable product. And once that happened, everything changed. Physical defense became dangerous optics. Hard fouls became bad for business. And certain mistakes stopped being fixable. One player learned that the hard way. Not because the league officially punished her. Not because the refs tossed her out. Not because the commissioner made an example out of her. But because after one moment on the court, her career started disappearing in places the public couldn't see. Phone calls stopped. Opportunities dried up. Doors closed without explanation. And that's the part nobody wants to talk about. This isn't just a story about Caitlin Clark. It's a story about money, power, and what happens when protecting the future quietly becomes more important than playing fair in the present. And by the end of this, you'll understand why some players believe the WNBA finally grew up, while others believe it sold its soul the moment it decided one player mattered more than everyone else. Because once a league builds itself around a single star, there's no such thing as a normal foul anymore. To understand why everything spiraled so fast, you have to understand just how violently Caitlin Clark altered the WNBA landscape. This wasn't a slow rise. It wasn't a give it a few seasons situation. It was immediate, relentless, and impossible to ignore. From the moment she stepped onto a WNBA court, Clark became the center of gravity. Defenses warped around her. Broadcasts followed her. And fans who had never watched a full WNBA game suddenly knew the schedule by heart. Her rookie season didn't just break records, it embarrassed the old ones. Points, assists, triple-doubles, logo threes that forced defenders to pick her up the moment she crossed half court. But the real story wasn't on the stat sheet. It was in the stands. Arenas that used to struggle to fill lower sections were suddenly packed to the rafters. Teams adjusted ticket prices overnight. Road games turned into home atmospheres for the Fever because fans came for one reason, and one reason only: to see Caitlin Clark. Indiana's attendance numbers didn't just improve, they exploded. Hundreds of thousands of fans poured through doors that used to stay quiet. Multiple arenas shattered attendance records simply because her name was on the marquee. And when the eyeballs showed up, the money followed. Television ratings surged into territory the league had never touched. Games featuring Clark weren't just outperforming past seasons. They were redefining expectations. Networks that once treated WNBA coverage as filler content started reshuffling primetime slots. Sponsors noticed immediately. Suddenly, brands that had ignored women's basketball for decades were fighting for placement. Jerseys sold faster. Merch disappeared off shelves. Campaigns weren't built around teams anymore. They were built around one face. Her face. Behind closed doors, league executives weren't even pretending otherwise. Caitlin Clark wasn't just Rookie of the Year. She was the economic engine, the proof of concept, the long-awaited answer to a question the WNBA had been asking since 1996. Can this league finally stand on its own? For the first time, the answer looked like yes. But there's a side effect when one player becomes that important. Every hit feels heavier. Every fall looks scarier. Every mistake threatens something bigger than basketball. And while fans were celebrating the rise, something else was happening beneath the surface. Veterans who had spent years grinding in relative obscurity watched the spotlight shift overnight. Players who helped build the league saw a newcomer receive attention, endorsements, and protection they never did. Resentment didn't need to be loud. It just needed to exist. And in a league where physical play has always been part of the culture, the line between sending a message and crossing a boundary suddenly mattered more than ever. Because once Caitlin Clark became the league's most valuable asset, hurting her, intentionally or not, stopped being just a basketball issue. It became a business risk. And the league, whether it admitted it or not, wasn't prepared to let that risk slide. But the Real warning didn't come from a suspension. It came from what happened next. before the headlines, before careers started collapsing, before players realized there were consequences that didn't show up in the box score. There were signs. They didn't come as suspensions or league statements. They came as moments that felt small at the time, just another hard play, another physical exchange in a league that has never shied away from contact. Early in Caitlin Clark's rookie season, defenders tested her. They pressed up higher than normal. They bumped her off cuts. They leaned into her landings just a fraction longer than necessary. None of it was illegal on paper. All of it sent a message. Welcome to the WNBA. For decades, this was how the league operated. Rookies earned respect by surviving contact. Veterans established hierarchy by making newcomers uncomfortable. Physicality wasn't dirty, it was tradition. But Caitlin Clark wasn't a normal rookie. Every time she hit the floor, cameras zoomed in. Every time she got up slowly, social media lit up. Every shove replayed 1,000 times before the next possession even started. And that's when the dynamic shifted. The league could ignore a hard foul on a role player. It couldn't ignore one on the player driving ratings. The first major flashpoint came under the brightest lights. National broadcast. Sold-out arena. The kind of game the WNBA desperately needed to go smoothly. Clark released a pass and turned to run back on defense. Her eyes followed the ball, not the defender closing in behind her. She never saw it coming. The contact wasn't subtle. A shoulder drove into her back with force that had nothing to do with the play. Clark hit the floor hard. The crowd gasped. The whistle blew late. On replay, it looked worse. No attempt at the ball. No defensive angle. Just impact. The refs upgraded it to a flagrant one. Technically, that was accountability. But emotionally, publicly, it felt like nothing. No ejection. No suspension. No fine that mattered. Just another possession, another inbound, another night of basketball moving on as if nothing significant had happened. Except something had. The clip didn't die after the game ended. It spread. Sports shows replayed it on loop. Commentators slowed it down frame by frame. Fans argued intent, jealousy, resentment, and protection. And when the player responsible doubled down instead of backing off, the tone changed. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just heat of the moment. That response mattered more than anyone realized. Because at that moment, the league was watching. Sponsors were watching. Executives were watching. Not to decide punishment, but to assess risk. And while the official record shows nothing more than a flagrant foul, the unofficial response began almost immediately. By the time the next season approached, the noise around that player wasn't about basketball anymore. It was about optics. About whether signing her was worth the attention. About whether one roster spot was worth weeks of uncomfortable questions. Teams didn't say no. They said nothing. Calls went unanswered. Interest evaporated. Options quietly disappeared. And that's when the message started to sink in. The foul didn't end her career. But who she fouled changed everything. That was the warning shot. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. And most players adjusted. They backed off just enough. They played physical but careful. They understood the cameras weren't neutral anymore. But one veteran didn't adjust at all. And her decision turned a warning into a precedent. By the time Diamond DeShields made her decision, the warning signs were already there. Everyone in the league had seen the replays. Everyone had heard the debates. Everyone understood, at least quietly, that things were different now. But DeShields wasn't some fringe player clinging to relevance. She was established, respected, a champion, a former top draft pick who had paid her dues long before Caitlin Clark became a household name. She came from the era where nothing was given, where physicality was survival, where respect was earned through contact. And that's exactly why what happened next hit differently. The game itself wasn't close. The outcome wasn't in doubt, which made the moment feel even heavier. Clark cut through the lane without the ball, focused on space, not contact. DeShields tracked her the entire way. Not the pass, not the angle, just her. What followed wasn't basketball instinct. It was a choice. DeShields lowered her shoulder and drove straight through Clark's body. No play on the ball. No defensive justification. Just force, delivered clean and deliberate. Clark went down hard. The arena reacted instantly. You could feel it through the screen. Not excitement. Not competitiveness. Shock. Slow motion made it worse. You could see the load-up. The adjustment in stride. The point of impact. And then came the moment that sealed it. DeShields reached down with an outstretched hand, a gesture that looked sportsmanlike on the surface, but fooled absolutely no one. The cameras caught everything, every angle, every reaction. The refs called another flagrant one. Again, on paper, nothing extraordinary. But this time, the reaction didn't fade. The clip didn't cycle out of the news. It dominated it. Analysts stopped using neutral language. Words like calculated and intentional entered the conversation. Sponsors who had invested heavily in the Clark era weren't watching as fans anymore. They were watching as stakeholders. And what they saw was their investment getting flattened on national television. That's when the pressure started to build behind the scenes. Not from fans, not from players, from money. Because if the league couldn't protect the one player responsible for its surge, what exactly was being sold to advertisers? Nobody announced a crackdown. Nobody admitted panic. But the atmosphere shifted. Front offices started asking different questions. Not can she help us win, but what follows her? Chicago didn't make a spectacle out of it. They didn't issue a farewell campaign. They simply let her walk. No tribute posts. No public appreciation. Just silence. New York took a chance, quietly. A low-risk move. Minimal commitment. When the baggage followed her into the building, the experiment ended just as quietly. Weeks, not months. Then Connecticut. One last chance. One last reset. For a moment, it looked like the storm might pass. And then, 2 days before the season began, it was over. A short press release. No explanation. No context. Just a waiver. The timing was brutal. Too late for other teams. Too public to ignore. Too final to spin. Hours later, DeShields appeared on social media, sitting in a rental car, boxes stacked behind her, trying to explain a collapse that didn't make sense on paper. A career unraveled in less than a year. And the public wasn't sympathetic. Because by then, the narrative had already been written. You don't touch the league's future. Not like that. But here's the part that makes this uncomfortable. The WNBA never officially banned Diamond DeShields. Never suspended her long-term. Never fined her into oblivion. According to the rulebook, she served her punishment. According to reality, she didn't survive it. And that's when players started realizing something chilling. The punishment wasn't coming from referees anymore. It was coming from silence. This is where the story stops being about basketball. Because if you search the official record, you won't find anything extraordinary. No suspension notices. No lifetime bans. No commissioner standing at a podium explaining a zero-tolerance policy. On paper, everything looks normal. And that's exactly the problem. The WNBA didn't need to punish anyone publicly. The market handled it for them. Behind closed doors, the conversations changed tone. General managers stopped asking whether a player could score or defend. They started asking what came with her. What headlines follow her? What questions will sponsors ask? What stories will dominate the broadcast if she steps on the floor? In a league still fighting for financial stability, those questions aren't philosophical. They're survival. Sponsors didn't want to be attached to controversy. Networks didn't want replay packages that looked like violence instead of competition. Teams didn't want to become the next viral battleground in a culture where they never signed up for. So they did the safest thing possible. They avoided risk. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings never got scheduled. Interest faded without explanation. From the outside, it looked like coincidence. From the inside, everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't discipline. It was insulation. Protect the product. Protect the ratings. Protect the investment. And the clearest message was this. If you come with baggage that threatens the league's most valuable asset, you're not worth the trouble, no matter how talented you are. That understanding spread fast. Agents started warning clients to keep their distance. Coaches pulled players aside and talked about optics instead of positioning. Veterans who had built careers on physical play suddenly had to recalibrate instincts they'd relied on for years. Not because the rules changed, because the consequences did. And the chilling part? No one had to say it out loud. It became an open secret, a shared understanding, a reality you felt the moment your phone stopped buzzing. Players realized that once your name becomes linked to harming the face of the league, that association doesn't fade. It follows you from team to team, from tryout to tryout. Talent can't erase it. Production can't outweigh it. Because risk doesn't show up on stat sheets. This is how a two-track system quietly formed. There's the official track, where fouls result in free throws and warnings, where everyone is treated equally under the rulebook. And then there's the unofficial one, where certain actions trigger consequences no referee can call, no league memo can document, and no appeal process can reverse. In that system, careers don't end with suspensions. They end with silence. Some people call this overdue accountability. They argue that Clark absorbed hit after hit while the league looked the other way. And now the market is finally doing what referees wouldn't. Others see something darker. A system where justice depends on who you hit. Where the punishment isn't about intent, but impact on revenue. Where fairness becomes secondary to protection. And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. Because if one player can become untouchable through market forces alone, the league isn't just enforcing rules anymore. It's enforcing hierarchy. And that realization made players deeply uncomfortable. Because if this could happen to them, who's next? Nobody ever put it in writing. You won't find it in the rulebook. It's not in the collective bargaining agreement. No coach will say it on record. But every player knows it exists. Because you don't need an official policy when reality keeps teaching the same lesson over and over. Some agents started calling it career awareness. Others joked about it more darkly. But the meaning was always the same. There is one player you cannot afford to cross. Not because she's dirty. Not because she complains. Not because she asked for protection. But because everything flows through her now. Ticket sales. TV ratings. Sponsorship confidence. The league's credibility with mainstream audiences. When Caitlin Clark is on the floor, the WNBA isn't just hosting a game. It's showcasing its future. And once that future became financially real, tolerance disappeared. Front offices didn't need orders from the commissioner. They reached the same conclusion independently. Signing a player associated with taking out the league's centerpiece meant inheriting questions no one wanted to answer. Why would you bring that attention into your locker room? Why invite controversy when safer options exist? Why risk sponsor discomfort over one roster spot? So teams chose the path of least resistance. They picked less talented players with cleaner narratives. They prioritized optics over edge. They avoided headlines even if it cost them depth. And that's how the unwritten rule hardened into reality. You can guard Clark aggressively. You can double her. You can force tough shots. But the moment contact crosses into something that looks intentional, regardless of what you meant, your career enters dangerous territory. Intent doesn't matter. History doesn't matter. Resume doesn't matter. Only perception does. That's the part veterans struggle with. They come from a league culture where physicality was proof of competitiveness, where sending a message was part of the game, where nobody was protected from hard contact just because they sold tickets. Now that logic doesn't apply, because this isn't the same WNBA. This is a league balancing on its most profitable moment ever, terrified of losing it. And in that environment, ambiguity is deadly. One clip can follow you forever. One replay can rewrite your reputation. One moment can outweigh a decade of work. Players who once thrived on edge now hesitate. They pull up half a step earlier. They contest instead of collide. Not because they're afraid of fouls, but because they're afraid of fallout. And that fear changes the game. Not just how it's played, but how it's lived. Because when discipline becomes invisible and consequences become permanent, everyone starts self-policing. And that leads to the biggest divide yet. Some players believe this is necessary. Others believe it's dangerous. And that argument is tearing through the league quietly, underneath the highlight reels and record-breaking nights. Because the question isn't whether Caitlin Clark should be protected. The question is what it costs everyone else when she is. Ask around the league, and you'll hear two very different stories. Some players say this was inevitable. They argue Caitlin Clark took hit after hit during her rookie season, while officials hesitated, downplayed, or outright ignored what was happening. They point to replay after replay where the contact looked excessive and the response felt weak. From that perspective, what happened next wasn't punishment, it was correction. The market stepped in where referees failed. Sponsors applied pressure where the league stayed quiet. Teams protected what the rulebook wouldn't. In their eyes, this wasn't unfair. It was overdue. You don't get to target the league's most visible player and walk away like nothing happened. Not anymore. Not when so much is on the line. But then there's the other side, and it's harder to dismiss. Because if the punishment isn't written, isn't acknowledged, and isn't applied consistently, is it really justice? Or is it something else entirely? Critics argue that careers shouldn't end through whispers and avoidance. That discipline should be transparent, proportional, and applied equally, not decided by sponsor comfort and social media backlash. They ask uncomfortable questions. If Diamond DeShields had delivered the same hit to a player who didn't sell out arenas, would the outcome have been the same? If the clip didn't go viral, would the reaction have mattered? If the money wasn't involved, would anyone care? Deep down, everyone knows the answer. And that's what makes this unsettling. Because it suggests the league didn't just protect Caitlin Clark. It protected its investment. And once that becomes the priority, fairness becomes flexible. The league never had to say, hurt her and you're done. It let the system enforce it quietly, which creates a dangerous precedent. Not because Clark doesn't deserve protection, she does, but because protection without boundaries becomes power without accountability. Players start guessing where the line is instead of knowing it. They make career decisions based on fear instead of rules. They hesitate not because of fouls, but because of fallout. And that hesitation changes everything. Some veterans now believe the pendulum has swung too far. That physical defense is being policed out of the game not by refs, but by risk assessment. That the sport is being softened not for competition, but for presentation. Others shrug and say this is the price of growth. Every league protects its stars. Every business safeguards its assets. Women's basketball is finally being treated like a serious product. If that means adjusting behavior, so be it. And that's where the divide becomes impossible to ignore. Because both sides are right. The league needed Caitlin Clark. And the league changed because of her. But once survival becomes the priority, principles start bending in ways that are hard to undo. And that tension didn't stop at basketball. It spilled into conversations the league had avoided for years. Conversations about who gets celebrated, who gets protected, and who pays the price when the spotlight moves. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Not because anyone wants it to be, but because it was always there, waiting for the right moment to surface. Caitlin Clark didn't just arrive as a generational scorer. She arrived as a symbol. And symbols carry weight far beyond what happens on the court. The WNBA has always been a league dominated by black women. Built by them. Sustained by them. Carried through decades of limited coverage, underpayment, and cultural indifference. Long before sold-out arenas and primetime slots became reality. Then, almost overnight, the spotlight shifted. A white guard from Iowa became the face of the league. That fact alone doesn't imply wrongdoing. Clark didn't ask for the attention. She didn't control endorsement decisions. She didn't decide which highlights ran on loop. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. Veterans who had been producing at an elite level for years never saw this kind of attention. Never saw this level of protection. Never felt the league bend around their presence. So when Clark began receiving treatment that felt different, whether intentional or not, it reopened old wounds. Resentment didn't come from jealousy alone. It came from history. From watching equally talented players get overlooked. From seeing marketability outweigh contribution. From realizing the money arrived only when the right story showed up. And when the league responded to hard fouls on Clark with silence on paper, but consequences in reality, those feelings intensified. Because now it wasn't just about attention. It was about survival. Older players were aging out just as the money finally arrived. Years of grinding for visibility were rewarded with a front-row seat to someone else cashing in. And the unspoken understanding became this. The league is moving on, with or without you. That's a hard pill to swallow. It created a fault line between eras. Between those who built the league and those benefiting from its breakthrough moment. Between physical, hard-nosed basketball and a polished, sponsor-friendly future. And in that tension, emotions ran hot. Some players felt erased. Some felt replaced. Some felt like obstacles instead of contributors. That doesn't excuse dangerous play, but it explains the frustration behind it. At the same time, Clark became a lightning rod for arguments she never volunteered to represent. Every foul turned into a referendum. Every hit became a cultural debate. Every moment of contact was analyzed through layers that had nothing to do with basketball. And the league found itself stuck. If it defended Clark too loudly, it risked alienating the very players who built the sport. If it stayed quiet, it risked losing sponsors and momentum. So it chose the third option. Do nothing publicly. Let the market decide privately. And that decision changed everything. Because once race, legacy, and money intersect, neutrality becomes impossible. Silence gets interpreted. Inaction becomes a stance. Players started talking behind the scenes. Not on podcasts. Not on social media. But in locker rooms and private calls. They asked whether the league valued them the same way. They questioned whether protection was evenly distributed. They wondered what would happen if they were the ones on the floor instead. And that anxiety spread. Because if this moment taught players anything, it was that the league now operates on perception first and policy second. And perception is never evenly applied. This wasn't just a Caitlin Clark problem. It was a league identity problem. One that had been building for years, finally exposed by the pressure of success. And once exposed, it couldn't be put back. By the start of the next season, the change wasn't theoretical anymore. You could see it, not in press releases, not in rule changes, but in how players moved. Defenders picked their spots differently. Hands stayed higher instead of bodies leaning in. Closeouts slowed just enough to avoid collisions that might look bad on replay. Physicality didn't disappear. Fear did something worse. It made players hesitate. Coaches noticed it first. Not because they were told to, but because they had to adapt. Game plans started including conversations that had nothing to do with basketball mechanics. Where the cameras are. How certain plays will look in slow motion. What angles broadcast crews love to replay. Young players entering the league were quietly warned. Not formally, not officially, but in the same tone veterans use when they're trying to protect someone from a mistake they can't undo. Play hard. Just be smart. Smart didn't mean avoiding fouls. It meant avoiding moments. Moments that could be clipped, framed, replayed, and stripped of context. Because in this version of the WNBA, context doesn't survive virality. Once a clip escapes into the world, it stops belonging to the game. It belongs to discourse, to debate, to narratives that teams and players have no control over. And those narratives don't fade. Agents began factoring this into contract discussions. Not just production and fit, but public risk. Who does this player guard? How often will she be matched up against Clark? What's the likelihood of a physical moment becoming a week-long story? That calculus used to be unthinkable. Now it's normal. Teams started choosing safety over edge. Not because they didn't value toughness, but because toughness now came with liabilities they couldn't quantify. A hard-nosed defender with a reputation suddenly became a gamble. A cleaner, quieter player with less upside started looking safer. Not better. Safer. That distinction matters. Because it reshapes rosters subtly over time. The league doesn't change overnight. It shifts gradually, through decisions that make sense individually but alter the ecosystem collectively. The most competitive players adapt. They always do. They learn how to toe the line, how to play aggressively without triggering backlash, how to defend without delivering impact. Others struggle, not because they lack skill, but because their instincts were forged in a different version of the game. And that's where the resentment deepens. Because now, it's not just about Caitlin Clark being protected. It's about everyone else being asked to change. Change how they defend. Change how they express emotion. Change how they play under pressure. All while pretending nothing changed at all. The league insists the rules are the same. And technically they are. But the environment isn't. And players feel it every time they step on the floor. Every foul on Clark is different. Not because of intent, but because of consequence. The whistle might sound the same, but the aftermath never is. A hard foul on another player ends with free throws. A hard foul on Clark begins a conversation that stretches far beyond the game. That reality doesn't fade with familiarity. It sharpens. Players become hyper-aware of their bodies, their angles, their timing. They start thinking 2 moves ahead, not to gain advantage, but to avoid disaster. And when fear enters competition, something fundamental shifts. Not immediately, but gradually. And the league, whether it admits it or not, is still learning how to live with that shift. Because once a league realizes its future depends on one player staying upright, every decision becomes heavier. Every hit carries weight. Every fall feels existential. Every controversy threatens momentum. And momentum, once gained, is terrifying to lose. So the WNBA walks a tightrope. Protect too openly, and you fracture trust. Stay too quiet, and you risk chaos. For now, it's chosen silence. Let the market speak. Let teams decide. Let consequences happen without fingerprints. But silence doesn't resolve tension. It just buries it. And buried tension has a way of resurfacing when pressure builds. Which means this story isn't slowing down. It's stretching. Because as long as Caitlin Clark remains the center of gravity, the league will continue orbiting around her, adjusting, recalibrating, and occasionally colliding with its own contradictions. And every player knows it, whether they say it out loud or not. What most fans never see is how pressure lingers long after the whistle. Players don't leave it on the court. They carry it onto the bus, into the locker room, home with them. Because in this version of the WNBA, the game doesn't end when the clock hits 0. Every player knows that any moment involving Caitlin Clark can outlive the game itself. A single clip can overshadow an entire season's worth of work. A split-second decision can become the only thing people remember about you. That awareness creeps in slowly. At first, it's subtle. A half-step hesitation. A decision to contest with hands instead of body. A moment where instinct screams one thing, but caution overrides it. Then it becomes routine. Players start watching themselves on replay not to improve, but to assess damage. Not did I defend well, but how does this look? And that shift rewires how competitors think. Basketball has always been reactive. Read and respond. See an attack. Trust your instincts. Now instinct is filtered. Because instinct doesn't account for cameras. It doesn't consider narratives. It doesn't protect careers. So players start policing themselves. They avoid contact not because it's illegal, but because it's risky. They let plays go that they would have challenged a year earlier. They choose survival over statement. And over time, that does something dangerous. It creates quiet resentment. Not always toward Caitlin Clark herself, but toward what she represents. Because every time a defender pulls back, she's reminded that the rules are different now. That the margin for error isn't equal. That some players can afford mistakes and others can't. That realization doesn't explode. It simmers. In private conversations, players admit it feels like walking on glass. That one misstep could define them forever. That playing hard has consequences that used to belong only to repeat offenders or reckless players. Now anyone can be next. And when fear becomes evenly distributed but consequences aren't, frustration grows. Veterans feel it most sharply. They built careers on edge, toughness, and physical defense. Those traits were once praised. Now they're liabilities. They're told to adapt, but adaptation isn't neutral. It favors certain playstyles, certain body types, certain narratives. And while the league celebrates evolution, some players feel like they're being quietly phased out. Not through age, not through performance, but through incompatibility with the new reality. That's hard to accept, especially when the league never acknowledges the shift. From the outside, everything looks fine. Ratings are up. Attendance is strong. The product looks cleaner, safer, more marketable. Inside, players feel the pressure tightening, because they know this isn't about fairness. It's about preservation. And preservation doesn't care how long you've been here. It only cares about what keeps the lights on. So players adjust. They compartmentalize. They swallow frustration. But pressure doesn't disappear just because it's managed. It builds. And the longer the league avoids naming it, the more likely it becomes that something cracks again. Not necessarily in one big moment, but in dozens of small ones. Missed contests, pulled punches, games that feel different even if they look the same. And that's the cost no one can measure yet. Because once players stop playing freely, the game changes in ways that statistics can't capture. And the league is still pretending nothing has changed at all. Locker rooms are where truth lives. Not press conferences, not interviews, not social media. It's where players say what they'd never say publicly. Where frustration leaks out in half sentences and long pauses. Where everyone understands the tone, even when no one finishes the thought. And after Caitlin Clark became the center of the league, locker rooms changed. Not dramatically. Gradually. At first, it showed up as jokes. Quiet ones. The kind that only land if you already understand the tension. Careful guarding her. Don't end up on Twitter tonight. Make sure that one looks clean. Everyone laughed. But laughter is often just fear wearing a mask. Because beneath the jokes was a shared understanding. Mistakes aren't equal anymore. Players started noticing how conversations shifted after games involving Clark. Not about rotations or missed shots, but about optics. About whether something would blow up. About whether the team would need to answer questions that had nothing to do with winning or losing. That kind of awareness changes chemistry. Teammates stop trusting instincts. They stop encouraging edge. They stop backing each other fully, because backing the wrong moment can drag everyone into controversy. No one says it directly, but you feel it. You feel it when a teammate doesn't rotate as hard because she's scared of contact. You feel it when a defender pulls up instead of finishing a play. You feel it when a coach hesitates to challenge a call because the narrative is already set. And when trust erodes, so does unity. Players begin separating into quiet camps. Those who believe protecting the league's future is necessary. Those who believe the league abandoned its own principles. Those who don't want to pick sides but feel trapped between them. That division doesn't show up on the scoreboard. It shows up in silence. In the way conversations stop when someone walks in. In the way eyes shift when certain plays are mentioned. In the way players choose their words carefully, even among teammates. And that's dangerous for a league built on collective struggle. Because the WNBA didn't survive its early years on star power alone. It survived on solidarity. On players standing together when resources were thin and recognition was scarce. Now success has arrived. But success has introduced hierarchy. And hierarchy breeds suspicion. Some players wonder if the league would protect them the same way. Others already know the answer. That knowledge sits heavy, especially when the league insists everything is equal. Because players aren't arguing with the rules. They're arguing with reality. And reality says that once a league finds a face that sells, that face becomes more than a player. It becomes insurance, which means everyone else becomes expendable. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but functionally. And that's the kind of truth locker rooms struggle to hold. Because once you realize the system doesn't see you the same way, you start questioning everything. Not just fouls, but loyalty. Not just protection, but value. And when players start asking themselves whether they're truly protected or just tolerated, unity becomes fragile. The league keeps moving forward. The games keep selling out. The numbers keep rising. But underneath, trust is thinning. And when trust thins, it doesn't break loudly. It cracks quietly, one moment at a time. In today's WNBA, basketball isn't just played on the court. It's played in headlines, in thumbnails, in 30-second clips stripped of context. And once a narrative forms, it moves faster than any player ever could. After the Clark incidents, media coverage didn't just report events. It categorized people. This player is physical. That one is dirty. This one is emotional. That one is dangerous. Those labels stick. Not because they're always accurate, but because they're convenient. Once a player is framed as a problem, every future moment gets filtered through that lens. A normal foul becomes another example. A routine play becomes a pattern. Even clean defense gets scrutinized for intent. And the worst part? There's no appeal process. You don't get to sit down with the internet and explain context. You don't get a full season to rewrite perception. You don't get grace. Because the clip already decided. Media outlets chase engagement, not nuance. And nothing drives engagement like controversy wrapped around a familiar name. So players linked to Clark-related moments found themselves trapped. Not suspended, not fined, just permanently associated with a storyline they couldn't outrun. Every broadcast reminded viewers of that hit. Every matchup resurrected the clip. Every defensive possession carried baggage. And once the narrative becomes profitable, it doesn't fade. It gets reused. Sponsors see it. Teams see it. Front offices see it. They don't need proof of future behavior. They only need plausible risk. And in a league still building its financial footing, plausible risk is enough to walk away. This is how players become untouchable without being banned. No one says they're done. No one closes the door officially. The door just stops opening. And players feel it immediately. Invites disappear. Opportunities shrink. Silence replaces communication. They start watching other players get chances they never receive. Younger, less experienced, less proven, but safer. Because safety, in this era, isn't about defense. It's about narrative compatibility. And once a player is labeled incompatible with the league's new image, there's nothing basketball skill alone can do to save them. That's the quiet cruelty of modern sports media. It doesn't punish you for what you do. It punishes you for what people think you represent. And Caitlin Clark's rise didn't create this system, but it exposed it. Because when one player becomes the face of a league, anyone perceived as threatening that face becomes a villain by default. Even if that wasn't their intention. Even if that wasn't the reality. Intent doesn't survive virality. Only optics do. And once optics harden into narrative, Your career exists inside a box you didn't build and can't escape. What makes this entire situation possible isn't cruelty. It's rationalization. Front offices don't wake up wanting to end careers. They convince themselves they're making logical decisions in a difficult environment. They tell themselves it's not personal. They tell themselves it's about fit. They tell themselves it's about timing, roster balance, cap space, chemistry. And in isolation, every decision makes sense. Why take on a player who brings headlines when another player doesn't? Why invite controversy when stability is finally within reach? Why risk sponsored discomfort when the margins are still thin? No one has to say Caitlin Clark's name out loud. Everyone understands it anyway. Executives frame it as responsibility, as protecting the league's momentum, as safeguarding the future not just for one player, but for everyone who benefits from the growth she sparked. In their minds, they aren't choosing sides. They're choosing survival. And survival just happens to have consequences. The problem is that when everyone makes the same reasonable decision, the outcome becomes devastating for the same few people over and over again. Careers fade not because of lack of talent, but because of association. Reputations harden not because of repeated behavior, but because of one moment. Opportunities disappear not with explanation, but with silence. And silence is powerful. Because silence tells players exactly where they stand without ever saying it directly. You're not banned. You're just not wanted. That distinction protects the league legally, publicly, and emotionally. It allows everyone involved to avoid guilt while still benefiting from the outcome. No villain. No accountability. Just results. And as long as Caitlin Clark continues to drive ratings, attendance, and cultural relevance, that system stays intact. Because dismantling it would mean admitting something uncomfortable. That the league doesn't just protect players equally. It protects what keeps it alive. This story was never really about a foul. It was about power. It was about what happens when a league finally finds its breakthrough moment and realizes how fragile it is. Caitlin Clark didn't ask to become untouchable. She didn't demand protection. She didn't control how the system reacted around her. But once she became the center of the WNBA's future, the rules stopped living on paper. They moved into shadows. And in those shadows, careers didn't end loudly. They ended quietly. Some people will say this is justice, that players crossed a line and paid the price. Others will say it's a warning sign, proof that fairness bends when money enters the equation. Both can be true at the same time. The WNBA is growing faster than ever. It's more visible than ever. And it's more fragile than it's ever been. That combination creates pressure. Pressure creates protection. And protection always creates inequality, whether anyone intends it or not. Every player in the league now understands the stakes. Not just how to play, but who not to touch, what moments to avoid, and how quickly everything can disappear. This isn't just the Caitlin Clark era. It's the era where the league learned what it was willing to sacrifice to survive. And the next time a hard foul happens,